Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's podcast. I'm Abella, and I'm here with Mike. How are you, Mike?
Hi, Abella. I'm great. Thank you. Excited to be here with you all. Today, we're talking about something really interesting, which is understanding different English accents. We're going to focus on three very popular accents: American, British, and Australian. That's right. Let's start with the American accent. Now, the American accent is spoken in the United States. It's one of the most common accents because so many people in the world watch movies and TV shows from America, so many people are familiar with it.
Yes, exactly. So when we talk about accents, we mean the way people speak, right? People from different places have different ways of pronouncing words. It's not just about the words themselves, but also how they sound. This is why we have so many accents in English. And today, we'll take a closer look at these three accents because they are some of the most common ones you'll hear when you learn English. Yes, exactly. The American accent can be very different depending on which part of the United States you're in. For example, if you're in New York, the accent sounds different from someone in California. Even the way people pronounce vowels changes a lot.
Absolutely. One of the key things about the American accent is the way they pronounce their sound. It's very strong. If you listen to someone speaking with an American accent, you'll hear the R very clearly at the end of words like car or father. It's very different from the British accent, where the R isn't always pronounced.
Right, and that's something interesting about American English. Now, let's talk about the British accent. The British accent is often what many people think of when they imagine how English should sound. But even in Britain, there are so many different accents. Some people speak with a very formal accent, while others have a more relaxed, regional accent.
Yes, the British accent is not just one accent. In fact, the received pronunciation is considered a formal British accent, and it's the one that you might hear on the news or in educational programs. This accent is very clear and doesn't use strong R sounds like the American accent. If you listen closely, words like car or better might sound different.
It's true. For example, in the British accent, the R at the end of words is often not pronounced, so car might sound more like car. Also, British English often uses a lot of specific words and phrases that are different from what we hear in American English. But don't worry, we'll dive deeper into that later.
And now, let's talk about the Australian accent. Australian English is quite unique, and I think it's a fun accent to listen to. People from Australia often speak very quickly, and they have some interesting slang.
Yes, Australian English has its own charm. Australians sometimes shorten words or make them sound a little more casual. For example, afternoon becomes arvo, and breakfast is often shortened to brekkie. But even though they speak quickly, their pronunciation is still very clear, and you can usually understand them once you get used to it.
Right, and when it comes to pronunciation, the Australian accent tends to soften certain sounds. For instance, they might pronounce a word like mate with a little more of a dip in their voice. It gives the accent a very relaxed feel, which makes it sound friendly and warm.
I agree, Mike. The Australian accent definitely has a relaxed vibe to it. And it's something many people enjoy listening to, even if they don't understand every word at first. It can take a bit of practice, but once you get used to it, it's really cool.
Definitely, and even though American, British, and Australian accents are all English accents, they are so different from each other. And that's the beauty of learning English. You get to explore these different ways of speaking and get a feel for how people in different parts of the world communicate.
Exactly, there's no right or wrong way to speak English. The important thing is that you understand what's being said, and the more you listen, the easier it will be to recognize these accents and understand them.
So let's dig a little deeper into some of the specific features of these accents, starting with the American accent. One thing that really stands out in American English is the pronunciation of vowels. For example, the A sound in words like cat or apple is pronounced much differently than in British English. In American English, the A is more like a short G sound. So, in American English, cat sounds more like ket.
Yes, that's a good point, Mike. And if we compare that to the British accent, you'll notice that they pronounce the vowels more clearly. For instance, in the British accent, cat might sound more like cot, with a longer vowel sound. It's a subtle difference, but if you're listening carefully, you'll definitely notice it.
Exactly, Abella. And there's also something very important to mention: stress. In American English, certain syllables in words are stressed differently than in British English. For example, take the word advertisement. In American English, the stress is usually on the second syllable, -tise-ment, but in British English, the stress is on the third syllable, -tise-ment.
Oh, yes, I've noticed that too. The stress changes can make a huge difference in how a word sounds. So, it's not just about pronunciation, but also about how we stress different parts of the word. Now, Mike, let's talk a little about Australian English. It's pretty interesting because it shares some things with both American and British English, but it has its own unique qualities, right?
Yes, exactly. One of the things that stands out in Australian English is how relaxed the pronunciation is. It's common to hear Aussies blend words together, almost like they're shortening the word in a fun way. For example, they'll say "how are you" as "howya," and they'll often drop certain sounds in words, like the T in words like butter, which can sound like ba.
That's such a good point, Mike. And also, Australians have a very unique way of using certain sounds in their speech. They have something called the Broad Australian accent, which is the strongest form of the accent. This one is really noticeable because it sounds a bit more stretched out, and vowels are more pronounced. But there are also general and cultivated accents, which are a bit softer.
Right, and one thing that is really fun about Australian English is the slang. As I mentioned earlier, Australians love to shorten words, but they also use some really cool and funny expressions. For example, when someone is feeling tired, they might say they're knackered, or if they're going to the beach, they might say they're going to the surf.
I love that. And the best part is that Australian slang has become so popular around the world. So, even if you're not in Australia, you might hear some of these words in movies, TV shows, or even when talking to Australians online. It's like you're getting a little piece of Australian culture wherever you are.
Exactly. It's amazing how these accents reflect the culture of the country. Each accent tells a story of the place where it comes from. And it's really important to remember that, no matter what accent you're learning, the goal is to be understood and communicate effectively.
Yes, communication is the key, and the more you listen to different accents, the more familiar you'll get with them. It's not about trying to copy every accent perfectly, but just about getting comfortable with the sounds and rhythm of the language.
And don't forget, there's always room to practice. The more you speak and listen to different accents, the more natural it will feel. You'll start to pick up little details, like how people pronounce certain sounds or how they stress certain words.
Now, let's talk a little about how different accents can affect understanding. Sometimes, when you're learning English, it can be difficult to understand an accent you're not used to. For example, if you're used to hearing an American accent and then you hear a British or Australian accent, you might feel confused at first. But don't worry, it's totally normal, and with practice, it gets easier.
That's right, Abella. It's all about getting used to the sounds. One way to improve is to listen to a lot of different English content, like podcasts, movies, or YouTube videos. If you keep hearing the same accent over and over, your brain will start to pick up on the differences.
Exactly, Mike. And something that really helps is learning the common phrases and expressions from each accent. For example, in American English, people might say "How's it going?" when they ask someone how they're doing. But in British English, it's more common to hear "How are you?" or even just "All right."
Yes, and in Australian English, it's very common to hear GJ as a greeting. They also often use the word mate when talking to friends. For example, you might hear, "How's it going, mate?" It's very friendly and casual, which is one of the things that makes Australian English so warm and welcoming.
I love how different expressions make each accent feel special. It's like a little window into the culture of each country. But Mike, when it comes to listening, it's not just about understanding words. Sometimes the rhythm and intonation are important too, right?
That's a great point, Abella. The rhythm and intonation can really change the meaning of what someone is saying. For example, in American English, the tone might be a bit more energetic or excited, while in British English, the tone can sometimes sound a little more formal or calm. Australians tend to have a more relaxed, sing-song way of speaking, which gives their accent a friendly feel.
Right, and that's why it's so important to listen to real-life conversations in different accents. You can start to understand the flow of the language, not just the individual words. It's about understanding the feeling behind the words as well. This can make learning much more enjoyable and easier in the long run.
Absolutely. And when you're learning English, you don't have to focus on just one accent. It's helpful to be familiar with different accents because when you travel or talk to people from different countries, you'll be able to understand them better. Plus, it's fun to try out different accents.
Yes, it's always fun to play around with accents. But remember, the main goal is communication. If you speak clearly and practice often, people will understand you no matter which accent you have.
And one of the best things about learning English is that there's always more to discover. You can explore different accents, learn new vocabulary, and understand more about the cultures that speak English.
That's what makes learning English so exciting. And don't forget, if you ever feel confused or stuck, just keep practicing. Over time, you'll start to feel more comfortable with all the different sounds and accents.
Let's now focus a little more on how accents can affect how we use English in everyday situations. When you first start learning English, it's common to focus on grammar and vocabulary, but as you get more advanced, you'll also need to think about how people speak in different regions.
That's a great point, Mike. For example, when you're speaking with someone from the US, you might hear different vocabulary or even grammar than if you were speaking with someone from the UK. In American English, for instance, people often use the word sidewalk to refer to what we walk on, but in British English, they say pavement. These small differences can be confusing at first, but they're part of what makes each accent special.
Exactly, and sometimes these vocabulary differences can even be funny. Take the word chips, for example. In American English, chips means the thin, crispy snack you eat from a bag. But in British English, chips refers to what Americans call fries. So imagine ordering chips in the UK, and you get a plate of fries. It's all part of the fun.
I love how different words can completely change the meaning of a sentence depending on where you are. It's not just about accents, but also about the culture and how language evolves in different places. And these differences aren't just for vocabulary. You'll also notice some grammatical differences between American, British, and Australian English.
That's true, Abella. For example, in American English, people might say, "I already ate," when talking about something they did earlier. But in British English, they might say, "I've already eaten." The grammar is slightly different, and even though both ways are correct in their respective regions, it's good to understand how these differences work.
Yes, exactly. And with Australian English, you'll notice some similarities to British English, but there are also some unique expressions that you might not hear in either American or British English. For example, Australians love to use the word she be right, which means everything will be fine or everything will work out. It's a very Australian way of expressing optimism.
That's a great example. And Australians also love to use the word bogan to refer to someone who might not follow social norms or have a more casual, unpolished style. It's a fun, playful term, but it's also a good reminder of how language can reflect the personality of a country.
Exactly. And as we're talking about these differences, it's important to remember that no accent or version of English is better than another. Each one has its own charm, and they all help shape the way people communicate in different cultures. The most important thing is being able to understand each other and be understood.
Right? Bella, the beauty of English is that it's so widely spoken around the world, and no matter where you go, you'll meet people who speak it differently. It gives you a chance to explore new ways of communicating and to learn about different cultures.
And speaking of exploring, it's a good idea to try listening to podcasts, watching movies, or reading books in different English accents. That will help you get familiar with the rhythms and sounds of each accent and make it easier to understand them over time.
Yes, and remember, practice makes perfect. Don't get discouraged if it takes time to get used to different accents. The more you listen and practice, the easier it will be to pick up on those small differences. It's all part of the learning process.
Absolutely. And as you continue learning, try not to focus too much on sounding perfect. It's more important to feel comfortable and confident in your ability to communicate. English is about expressing yourself and connecting with others, no matter which accent you have.
Well said, Bella. So keep practicing, keep listening, and most importantly, enjoy the process of learning. There's so much to discover in the world of accents.